this on Monday, December 12th. If you're starting to watch this, you should have already taken your reading quiz, which I sent to your mom. And we're picking up with just note cards on Canada. Okay, Caleb, can you cut the lights, please? All right, here are the easy questions. Largest country in the world is?
Russia.
Second largest?
Canada.
Yeah, which is really kind of crazy because it's not China. That's number 3. And if you overlay Russia right here on the United States and Canada, you can kind of see the comparison point to it. Russia's very large. Okay, who controlled the Canadian area after the French and Indian War? Who ended up in control of Canada?
The
British. And who was it that they took control from? Who had it before?
British.
The French, right. So it started off in French hands, it ended up in British hands. There were still a ton of French people living in Canada, and that is part of Canada's storyline to this day. Has anyone here ever visited Canada? You have? Do you remember going? No. Has anyone visited and you remember it? Okay, when you drive from America into Canada, one of the things that will strike you almost instantly is that the signs will be in a different language. What language? French. But do they speak English there? Yes, they do speak English. In 1969, Canada became officially bilingual. It always had some French, some English, some like who's in charge here, but of course you saw that it was Britain that ended up actually taking it until they gained their independence. But that issue of the language and what language are they speaking, it has been an issue to this day. So I'll remind you of something. Do you remember when we talked about the Mexican-American War? Do you remember that I told you that when all those people just found themselves American, what language were they speaking? Spanish. Did the American government let them keep speaking Spanish officially? No. What did they tell them after 30 years? Yeah. They said, hey, you've had long enough. You're American. Start speaking English now. And it was most penalizing to them in legal settings, in business settings, because it was really hard to do legal, complicated stuff in a language that's not your own. There's been a little bit of that issue in Canada, except the story ends differently in Canada. Instead of it ending with like, hey, you're Americans, just speak English. Instead, Canada has maintained multiple languages for a really long time. And when officially it became required to put everything into both French and English, that was in 1969, that's also when there became a higher value of indigenous languages, because there's tons of languages in Canada. Not just 2, there's a lot of them. But all of it traces its roots back to here, to this beginning part where you see that there was colonizing happening by the European countries. All right, so let's have our colonizing review, since that's what we keep talking about over and over again. Okay, in this part of the world, Florida, the Caribbean, Central America, the islands, what European country colonized that area? Spain. Okay. What about in this part of North America? Who colonized where our 13 colonies were? The British. And who tended to colonize up here in the north in Canada? It was the French. Now what if we go all the way down to South America to Brazil? Who colonized there? Portugal. So you guys see the pattern? You see that there was like specific areas that they were going to, and that's why most of Central America and the islands, mostly it's Spanish facing still, language-wise. So you can see a bit of this, but the red part here was the British claims. The blue was French claims because the French used to control all the way down through the Louisiana Territory. I'm going to tell you about this red piece on the next slide because it has kind of a funny story. But of course, the Florida was not British. All right, here's another one. The red being again British. The pink was France, though it kind of dripped down into here, but this was mostly Native American. There's a difference between air quotes claiming something and actually settling there. Sometimes the people like the French, they'd claim Louisiana and they hadn't even mapped it all. They barely even knew what was in it. But like when Spain claimed all of this area for a while and then just sold it off because they didn't even have settlers there. But here's the kind of funny one, Rupert's Land. Isn't that an awesome name, first of all? It totally makes me so curious. Who in the world is Rupert? And why is it red like British when the British were all down here? It was one of those quirky things in history where the King of England gave, and I'll put that in air quotes, gave the area around the Hudson Bay to Prince Rupert. All right, so I'm already thinking about what movie had a Prince Rupert in it?
I feel like I've seen a movie with Prince Rupert.
Was it The Princess Bride? No.
No, that's
There's a Prince Rupert who showed up in some movie.
Oh, is it in Princess Diaries?
Maybe it was. It just seems like the kind of name you'd make fun of, right? Prince Rupert.
Yeah, who names their kid?
Well, apparently it's British because this was a British prince. But this area that was Rupert's Land was vast. It was enormous. And it was not settled by British people. It was all French people up there. So for this longest time, it was on the map as a British area. And it's part of why Britain thought that they could claim this area because they had this massive amount of land, Rupert's Land, that had been theirs. But again, everybody up there was speaking what language? French. It was French settlers, not British settlers who were up here. So that actually comes back into the story. But first, let's talk about why people who spoke English ever ended up in Canada. 1770s. That's your trigger. That should remind you that something super important happened in 1776. Charlotte, what happened in 1776? The other one. The Revolutionary War happened in 1776. And so why were the people leaving America and going to Canada? They didn't want to work. They were loyal to the British. They said, no thank you, revolution. We don't want a revolution. We'll just go north to Canada because it was there's Rupert's Land, there's British areas. We'll just go there. So a bunch of British fled, and this put pressure on the fact that there was all these French settlers, and now you have British people going up there. This area in that funny named Lower Canada and Upper Canada, it did have a bit of a rebellion, but what makes this lesson show up in our in our book at this point, is this. Something happened. Do you know, Caleb, what's the historic thing that happened after this kind of rebellion that went nowhere? Yes, and what did they do before they declared you get to have your own self-government? They did what? Yeah, no, that's the next question when they said that. Do you remember, David, what was the historic thing that brought about what Caleb's talking about? Yes, there was a Durham report, and they said, like what Caleb said, the Canadians need to have their own self-government. Okay, pause and think about this for a minute. In our country, in America, we had a rebellion. Lots and lots of people died. This American Revolution, and who won in the end?
Us.
We did. We got independent from Great Britain. In Canada, the British said, let's do a study. I think they need government. Okay, you can have your freedom. So different.
They didn't want it because it's so cold up there.
I don't know if it was the cold. What do you think might be another explanation besides cold? Caleb? Exactly. They could still keep a lot of power, but they weren't going to have to go through another war because they had just gone through a war with America and lost. What were you going to say, Charlotte? Money, yeah. And land, but land is money, right? Land and territory are money. Yes, they didn't want to, all the suffering that happens with wars. So, this is the most amazingly boring part of history right here. It took me so long to get my brain around this chapter for our lesson because every time I read it, I just kept staring at the chapter saying, but what happened? What was it that actually happened? It was so boring and in such a good way. Imagine how great history would be if it were more boring. Fewer wars. Less like Napoleons. Fewer Napoleons and Hitlers and huge characters that throw the entire world into upheaval. What if world history were more like the boring Dominion of Canada lesson where they did a study and they were like, we think you need responsible self-government. Okay, let's make an agreement. Okay, you're free.
Some people are just evil, so you can't, like...
Yes,
And
it's
without
true.
it, then it would be worse for the future because we wouldn't know, like, what's really bad. At least there wasn't another Hitler.
At least, not in Canada. But you know what, when you think of Canada, and if you thought the lesson was kind of tedious or boring, I just want you to remember that's the point. It's okay. Because the point is that not everything in history has a war attached. And not everything in history has a dictator. Sometimes people just make good decisions based off of their own brains and their studies, and they actually sit in a room and come up with good compromises, which is lovely. All right, Tegan, what did the Durham Report require?
Like, they had to unite before they got their independence.
Exactly. It required uniting. If you need to go get a tissue, you can. I don't know if you can. Here's a picture of what we're talking about with Upper and Lower Canada. Upper Canada is close to us. Lower Canada is the vast frozen tundra going up. Although the areas closer to the water are not quite as cold as the areas that are more central. Who do you think this lovely man in the picture is that I put in here?
The dude.
What dude? Yeah.
John Lamington.
Nope. No, you said it.
The dude that wrote the
And what was his name? Durham. I think this is Durham. Prince of Durham. There we go. Yeah, I guess they go by both those names. So there you go. It was the dude, and look at him. What do you think about how he looks?
Kind of looks French.
He looks like a woman.
His haircut needs some work.
If you just put long hair on him, he looks like a woman.
He has a very pretty face. Yes. Looks baby face to me, like so young. But this is the guy that helped bring about the peaceful transition of power in Canada. All right, so on to more interesting parts of the history. Do any of you have Irish heritage in your background? So many of you do. And that's really interesting because it's kind of tied to this part of history. I don't know this for sure. Maybe your Irish relatives just decided to come over here. There was some immigration before this. But most of the Irish immigration to Canada, which eventually then came down to America, happened because of this. 1840s, 50s, it was the what? Potato famine. Now, to understand why a potato famine would matter, you have to remember that there's lots of cultures in the world that have one primary food group. What was it in Cambodia? Rice. Does anybody know in vast parts of Central Africa, what's the main food that's eaten? Anybody know? Well, food. You put spices on stuff. And you would want to put spices on this because it'd be boring. Anybody know? It's a root vegetable. It's called a yam.
Oh, I remember.
And it's not so sweet like our sweet potatoes. It's more of a plain yam. It's a root vegetable, so it grows underground. In Ireland, their main crop was potatoes. And I know it's super hard for you to understand, like, oh, how do you eat potatoes all the time? I don't know if they did. Like, maybe they had a little bit of meat, but not when they started going through starvation. They probably ate up all the sheep they had. And then they had potatoes were their thing, and then the potatoes got a blight, a disease, and all the potatoes in their country got ruined, rotted, inedible. Yes?
What happens if someone's allergic to
I think you die. And like it back in the day, right?
But how do you
I just don't
get
make
allergic
it.
to stuff by not eating it, right? Like, your body's not used to it. So if you ate potatoes all the time, then you probably wouldn't get.
Yeah. But I do think in cultures that don't have as good medical care, the people who are vulnerable populations, like because they have a nut allergy, they just die at a really young age. The first time you get exposed to it, there's no EpiPen, you die. So I do think it kind of like kills off the population of people that can't survive on it. Yes.
But I highly doubt that any Irish would have a potato allergy because usually you grow accustomed to it,
Mhm.
so you're in your DNA.
Yeah.
Genetics. Yeah, if after many years of that's what your family eats, that's
Right.
what their ancestors
And
eat,
potatoes,
so
yams, and rice are not commonly allergens.
Yeah.
Maybe what you put on it could be an
It's just
allergen,
like,
right?
it would be very, very rare if you're talking about like science
Yeah.
and genetics wise.
Yeah, for sure. What were you gonna say, DJ?
I think that it just makes sense that there's like a food for each country or state.
Yes.
Because I would.
What would our food be?
It'd be like
burgers.
Yeah.
Because I would.
All right. So think about what you just said. Burgers and ham. That is a wealthy country talking, because it takes vast resources to create meat. You have to feed a lot of food to an animal to grow the animal so you can then slaughter and eat the animal. It is way simpler and way easier to just eat the vegetables if you're short on food. So only the wealthiest countries could have meat as a primary food. Yes.
Because like if I were Irish, I would go and people would be like, well, how do you eat potatoes every day? I would go to the Cambodians and say, how do you eat rice every day?
Exactly. Same thing.
Like, but the spices, like,
It
you can
is,
switch up the spices.
Mhm.
Like, go on a
Yeah, I
cycle.
be putting rice in my chili and everything.
Yeah.
Rice.
Rice.
Yes.
Comment. So, Jyoti
I can
is allergic to potatoes, so she can't eat Chick-fil-A French fries.
Oh,
my
it's a
God.
that's a sad day. But you know what, Jody is not going to die by not eating Chick-fil-A French fries.
Yes, we are.
Are you guys familiar with this symbol? The red
Yes.
maple leaf. Maple because maple syrup, maple trees are big in Canada.
Oh, I hate
The red maple leaf is Canadian symbol, and July 1st is their day. In fact, if you're British and you're sensitive to people celebrating their independence from you, same. We blow off fireworks on the Canadians do it on July 1st. Americans do it on July 4th. We're all celebrating being independent.
Just a little bit,
What is
except
it?
for the British.
my mom's Australian, so when she grew up, she had to do all the British history.
Yes.
So everything is
And
like,
it's so
they
far
ran-
from Britain.
So it's completely like different.
Yeah.
Like, everything.
Yep.
Because she learns like Australian history, and then
I think they teach Australian history now, but it was a long time before Australia got free from Britain.
they're still not they still have power
still-
over it, and China already bought up most of its main ports. They
Yeah.
actually control its meat and milk market. But anyways, so she was taught the British, and so America ran away from Britain, and
Mm-hmm.
Canada ran away from Britain.
It's
and
so
Brit-
cool.
yeah,
That's so cool to think about the completely different view of it. Yes, what were you gonna say?
My mom is, my grandma was 50% British.
Okay.
And my mom is like 20% British.
Awesome. Now I wish you were about to tell me that you have First Nations Indigenous group heritage, but no. This tribe is the Inuit. Eskimo is the general term. Inuit is one of the specific tribes. Whaling, ice fishing, igloos, and these pictures are today, modern day Inuit people, First Peoples groups. Now, when you look at them, you probably have the same question I had. They still wear that stuff? Wait, they're still wearing furs? And the answer is yes. It's so much better than any synthetic coats that our fanciest coat factories have come up with. They live in temperatures that are sometimes sustained at negative 50 degrees Celsius for long periods of time. If you went outside dressed like you're dressed in that temperature, you would be DEAD, dead in 2 minutes. You wouldn't just get cold, you would die from the temperatures. So they basically take these caribou or they take these skins from like caribou, seal, and then they sew them together where the fur is on both your body side and the outside. They're completely waterproof, they're completely cold proof, and they can be outside for long periods of time and live in igloos, ice houses. And that's just the world that they live in. Look where they live. This is the North Pole. They are inside the Arctic Circle, really close to that.
What the heck? Why would you voluntarily live there?
So the
This is their people, and they survive there just fine.
So the blizzard.
They laugh at our like way of dressing. Okay, there are 14 provinces. You 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 are over here. Provinces and territories. And I'm gonna have to post this. I haven't gotten to this for anybody. But this is your note card, and Caleb, if you could cut the lights on, that would be helpful. Let me explain to you what you're writing down on the front side of this note card. Okay, first of all, when we think about the American story, race has always been central to it. Like, it could be black and white, it could be indigenous people, it could be what happened in Mexican-American War, it could be, in our immigration story. It's almost always about race when you're talking about American history. But it's not like that in every country. In Britain, the storyline is almost always about class. You guys know like Downton Abbey?
Yes, I love Downton Abbey.
So you have like the people who are upstairs and the people who are downstairs. That's not about race, that's about class. The servant class, the upper class. The lords and ladies, the regular people who are the workers. The fact that England still has kings, queens, princes, and princesses, wait, we're going to do the back of it. We have to do the back too. Kings, queen, princes, and princesses, that's a class issue. All right. What is the main thing about Canada? America, it's race. Britain, it's class. Canada, it's, want to guess? Language. In Canada, it's language. Language is the main thing you have to understand because I told you already about how both English and French are spoken, and in 1969 they became officially bilingual. Language is very political there. Everything about language is the way that it becomes political. And after the country became bilingual, that's when also people were allowed to, people started giving more space for indigenous languages. There are at least 60 different languages in Canada that are spoken by all these small groups of people. You know those Inuit people, they're not over there speaking French to each other or English. They have their own language. And so if you want to kind of like get your brain centered around something that's very Canadian, it's language. Specifically French and British. I'm sorry, French and English, but the language issue in general. I'll close by telling you a story that there was this little clip I watched from a movie. There were a bunch of Americans driving a big truck full of weapons. And they were coming in and they got pulled over by a Canadian police. And they were so sure that they were going to get in trouble for having a car full of weapons. But actually the truck that they were driving had a bunch of slurs against Canada spray painted on the side. Like, Canadians stink, we hate Canadians, they smell like dirt. Like, it just had stuff. And the police pulled them over and he said, he didn't give them a ticket for having weapons. He said, it's against the law for you to have those slogans in English. You're required to have everything in French as well as English in this country. And they were like, okay, so we got out. He was like, pay us $10. They're like, okay, here's $10. And then he handed them a can of spray paint and was like, write it in French. So he made them rewrite all of their anti-Canadian slogans in French and then let them go. So anyway, so a funny little clip from a movie and very Canadian.